In the spring of 1887, four little girls were dragged onto a livestock platform and sold to the highest bidder. Not cattle, not horses, children. What happened next would shake an entire territory to its core and change the law forever. If you've ever wondered how far one person's decision can reach, stay with me until the very end of this story, and drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this has traveled. The morning the Mercer girls lost everything for the second time, it was cold enough that their breath came out in pale white clouds, and the mud under their boots had frozen into jagged ridges overnight. Adeline noticed that first, the mud, how it had hardened into something almost sharp. She kept her eyes down on it as the sheriff's deputy led them across the yard, because if she looked up, she would have to see the faces of the people gathering at the edge of the fence, and she wasn't ready for that yet. She was 15 years old, and she was already so tired. Behind her, Lucy was crying softly, that small, hiccuping cry that 6-year-olds make when they're trying very hard not to. Adeline reached back without looking and found her little sister's hand. "Stop," she said quietly, not unkindly. "I can't." "You can. Just breathe." Nora walked on Adeline's left, jaw set, brown eyes moving constantly, cataloging exits, faces, distances. She was 12, and she had their mother's stubbornness written into every line of her face. Elsie walked on the other side of Lucy, holding the little girl's other hand, her 9-year-old shoulders hunched forward like she was trying to make herself smaller than she already was. The auction platform stood at the far end of the Caldwell Town Square, a raised wooden stage normally used for livestock sales. Hogs, mostly. Sometimes cattle. Sheriff Dolan had hammered a new sign to the post that morning. Adeline had caught 2 words before she looked away. Debt settlement. Their uncle, Roland Mercer, stood to the left of the platform with his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets, talking to a man in a gray suit Adeline didn't recognize. Roland wasn't a large man, but he had a way of filling whatever room he stood in with a kind of greasy confidence, like something spoiled that still insisted on taking up space. He'd been drinking since before sunrise. She could smell it from 10 feet away. He didn't look at the girls when they were walked past him. He hadn't looked at them much since he'd burned through every dollar their parents left behind. Their father, James Mercer, had died of a lung sickness 14 months earlier. Their mother, Clara, had followed him into the ground 8 weeks after that, as though she simply couldn't locate any reason to remain. The ranch they'd built outside of Caldwell, small but honest, 30 head of cattle, and a kitchen garden that had fed them through 2 hard winters, had passed to Roland by law because there was no will, and Roland was the only living male relative. That had been the first loss. The second loss came slower and uglier. Roland drank and gambled with the focused dedication of a man who had been waiting his whole adult life for an inheritance. By October, he'd sold the cattle. By December, he'd mortgaged the property. By February, the property itself was gone, lost on a single hand of cards in the back room of a saloon whose name Adeline never learned, which left 4 girls, and a debt Roland couldn't cover any other way. The law in the Kansas Territory in 1887 was a blunt instrument. Orphan children with no legal guardian beyond a blood relative could be made subject to debt proceedings if that relative declared himself unable to provide for them. The precise interpretation of this law was contested even then. Most decent people found it grotesque. But it existed, and Roland Mercer had found a lawyer willing to use it. The man in the gray suit, Adeline understood now, was that lawyer. Okay, the deputy's name was Harlan Cole. He was a young man, barely 25, and he had the uncomfortable look of someone who had been given an assignment he hadn't signed up for. He stopped at the bottom of the platform steps and turned to face the girls with an expression Adeline would remember for the rest of her life, somewhere between apology and complete helplessness. "I'm sorry," he said. "I truly am." "Then don't do it," Nora said. Harlan Cole opened his mouth and closed it again. He looked at the platform. He looked at the growing crowd. He put his hand on Nora's shoulder to steer her forward, and Nora jerked away from him so hard she nearly knocked Elsie sideways. "Don't touch me," she said. He didn't touch her again. He just stood aside and let them walk up the steps themselves, which was somehow worse, as though the dignity of climbing under your own power was supposed to be some kind of compensation. The platform was higher than Adeline expected. From up there, she could see the whole square clearly, the storefronts, the bare-limbed trees along the main street, the crowd that had materialized the way crowds always do around something awful. Maybe 40 people. Maybe more. She recognized the milliner, Mrs. Pratt, with her hand pressed to her mouth. She recognized the pastor's wife, who had brought them a pie 3 weeks ago and told Adeline she was praying for them. She recognized 2 ranchers who had bought cattle from their father. Nobody moved. Nobody said anything. That was the thing that lodged in Adeline's chest like a splinter, the silence. 40 people watching 4 children stand on a livestock platform, and not one of them stepped forward. Roland took his position near the auctioneer, a florid man named Grady who had been running sales in Caldwell for 15 years and clearly wished he were somewhere else entirely. Grady shuffled his papers, cleared his throat, refused to make eye contact with the platform. "We're here today for the settlement of debts incurred by the estate of James Mercer, deceased," Grady announced, in the monotone of a man reciting something he'd been told to say. "Pursuant to the application filed by Roland Mercer, legal guardian of the minor children herein—" "We're not property," Adeline said. Her own voice surprised her. It came out steadier than she felt, low enough that only the front rows heard it, but Grady faltered mid-sentence and looked up at the platform. "Miss, we're not property," she said again. Louder. A murmur moved through the crowd. Roland's face darkened. He made a small gesture to Deputy Cole, who climbed 2 steps up the platform and said quietly, "Please don't make this harder, miss." "Harder," Nora repeated from beside Adeline. "You want us to make this easier for you." Cole had no answer for that. Grady pressed on. He was doing the only thing he knew how to do, which was his job. He outlined the debt figure, $412, a number Adeline had memorized because hearing it repeated had burned it into her, and explained that the labor and domestic services of the 4 Mercer daughters would be auctioned to qualified bidders in order to satisfy the claim. Labor and domestic services. Lucy didn't understand what that meant. She was pressing her face into the side of Adeline's coat, and Adeline had her arm around her and was thinking very clearly and very carefully about the fact that she could not fall apart right now because Lucy was 6 years old, and if Adeline fell apart, there would be nothing left. The bidding started. The first man who called out a number was someone Adeline didn't know. Broad-shouldered, middle-aged, with the flat eyes of a man who valued things by their utility. He bid for Adeline alone. $60. A second voice came from somewhere near the back. $75. For Adeline and Nora together. A third man standing just to the left of Roland and whispering something to him first. $110. For all 4, he said, but he wanted to discuss the specifics of the arrangement with the guardian. The way he said specifics made Adeline's stomach turn to ice. Grady called for other bids with the forced neutrality of an auctioneer who understood that silence from the crowd meant complicity. The crowd was silent. People looked at their shoes. Mrs. Pratt had turned away entirely. Roland was smiling, just slightly, just enough. Nora's hand found Adeline's free hand and gripped it hard enough to hurt, which was what Adeline needed. Something to hold on to, something real and solid in the frozen air on top of that platform. 120, said another voice from further back. And then, from somewhere near the fence at the rear of the crowd, quiet, unhurried, with the particular kind of certainty that doesn't need to be loud to be heard, $450. The square went still. Not the uncomfortable, shifting silence of before. Something different. A held breath. A stopped clock. People turned. The crowd parted, slowly, the way water parts around something that moves through it with absolute purpose. The man who walked forward was not particularly tall, not particularly young, somewhere in his early 40s with the kind of face that weathering does things to, all angles and economy, dark eyes under a hat brim that he didn't bother to lift when he spoke. His coat was good but not new. His boots were working boots. He walked like a man who was used to covering ground and saw no reason to hurry or perform. He stopped at the foot of the platform. He looked up at the 4 girls, one long, assessing look, not unkind but not soft either. Then he looked at Grady. $450, he said again. For all 4, together. That's my only offer. Roland took a step forward, jaw working. Now hold on. Does it exceed the debt? The man asked. Not to Roland, to Grady. Grady looked at his papers. His voice was slightly unsteady. It does, yes. Then we're done. He reached into his coat and produced a folded leather case. I'll pay now, in full, before I leave this square. Adeline stared down at him. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, and she couldn't decide if this was better or simply a different category of terrible. 40 people watching, Roland's jaw tight with fury, Lucy's face still buried in her coat. Who are you? Adeline asked. He looked up at her again. Something crossed his face. Not quite surprise, not quite anything she had a name for yet. Gideon Hale, he said. I've got a ranch about 30 miles north. You'll have your own rooms and your own work, and nobody will touch you. That's all I can promise you right now. That's not enough, Nora said flatly. No, he agreed. It isn't. He said it without flinching, without trying to make it something better than it was. And that, somehow, was the thing that kept Adeline from screaming. Roland was across the square in 3 long strides, his voice climbing. These children belong in the custody of their family. This sale is being conducted under fraud. You can't just walk in here and... I just did, Gideon said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on Grady and the papers and the money he was counting out of the leather case, unhurried and methodical, while Roland's lawyer materialized at his elbow and began talking rapidly about legal challenges and proper proceedings. Gideon let the lawyer finish. Then he said, File whatever you need to file. I'll be there. He turned then and looked back up at the 4 girls on the platform. 4 pairs of eyes watching him with varying degrees of terror and anger and exhaustion. And he said, simply, Are you ready to go? They weren't ready. How could they be? But Adeline climbed down those steps first because someone had to, and she held Lucy's hand the whole way down, and she looked straight ahead when they passed Roland, who was red-faced and shaking, because looking at him would have cost her something she couldn't afford to spend. The crowd let them through. Some people stepped back deliberately, creating a clear path. Mrs. Pratt reached out and briefly touched Adeline's arm as she passed. Just a brush of fingers, nothing more. And Adeline didn't know what to do with it, so she didn't do anything, just kept walking. Gideon Hale's wagon was at the far end of the square. A good wagon, well-maintained, hitched to a pair of bay horses that stood patiently in the cold. He helped Lucy up first, wordlessly, efficiently, the way you'd hand up a small child if you were simply focused on the task, and then stood back while the older girls climbed up themselves. He didn't try to help them. He seemed to understand without being told that being helped by him right now would be the wrong thing. He climbed up front and gathered the reins. 30 miles, he said to no one in particular. We'll stop once if anyone needs to. Nobody answered. The wagon rolled out of the square. Adeline sat in the back with her 3 sisters pressed against her. Lucy asleep almost immediately, exhausted from crying, Elsie watching the town recede with enormous dry eyes, Nora staring at the back of Gideon Hale's head with the focused attention of someone memorizing a potential threat. The town disappeared behind them. The prairie opened up, vast and flat and colorless in the early spring cold. The sky, the pale gray of old pewter, the grass dead and brown and moving slightly in a wind that never seemed to stop. Adeline pulled her sisters closer and tried to think. She didn't know if this man was telling the truth. She didn't know if his ranch was what he said it was. She didn't know if 30 miles north was better or worse than what they'd just left. She knew exactly 4 things about Gideon Hale: his name, his profession, the amount he'd paid for them, and the fact that he'd looked her in the eye when she spoke to him. She didn't know yet if that was enough. Nora leaned close and said, just above the creak of the wagon wheels, "What do we do if he's lying?" Adeline watched the flat horizon and thought about that for a long time. "Then we figure something else out," she said finally. "That's not a plan." "No," Adeline agreed. "It's not." She pulled Lucy tighter. The little girl stirred faintly and went still again. The cold settled around them all like a held breath, and the prairie stretched out in every direction, and ahead of them the man who had just paid $450 for 4 girls he'd never met sat straight-backed and silent on the wagon bench, driving north into a winter that wasn't done with any of them yet. Adeline kept her eyes on the horizon. She didn't pray. She didn't hope too hard. She just watched the distance and breathed and held her sisters together the only way she knew how, by refusing, with every mile, to let go. The ranch appeared out of the prairie the way most things on the Kansas frontier did, without ceremony, without warning, just suddenly there where there had been nothing before. Adeline saw it first, a low cluster of buildings set back from a creek line, the main house built from timber and stone in a way that looked like it had been added to over years rather than planned all at once. A room here, a lean-to there, a covered porch that didn't quite match the original roofline, a barn that was larger than the house, fenced paddocks, a kitchen garden that was still just frozen earth and dead stalks from the previous season. 2 dogs that came running out to meet the wagon before it even crossed the creek, barking with the frantic enthusiasm of animals who hadn't seen enough company in too long. It was not beautiful. It was not the kind of place that announced itself. But it was solid, and it was standing, and after everything the past 24 hours had been, solid and standing counted for something. Lucy lifted her head from Adeline's shoulder, still puffy-eyed from sleep and crying. "Is that it?" "Seems like," Adeline said. "It's smaller than I thought." Gideon, from the front of the wagon, said, "It's bigger on the inside." It was the most he'd said in 30 miles, and all 4 girls looked at the back of his head with varying degrees of surprise. He didn't elaborate. The wagon rolled across the creek bridge, just 2 thick planks sturdy enough, and pulled up in the yard. He set the brake and climbed down and stood there for a moment, looking at the house the way a man looks at something he's been away from and isn't entirely sure welcomed him back. Then he turned to the wagon. "Come on then," he said. "I'll show you where you'll sleep." There were 2 rooms at the back of the house that he'd clearly prepared in some hasty and imperfect way. A pair of cots pushed together in the larger room for Adeline and Nora, a narrower room with a rope bed and a straw mattress for Elsie and Lucy. The quilts were clean but mismatched. There was a small iron stove in each room that he'd already lit before they arrived, which meant he'd planned for them, which meant this wasn't impulse. And Adeline filed that away without knowing yet what to do with it. He showed them the outhouse, the washroom, the pump in the yard. He showed them where food was kept, a pantry off the kitchen that was stocked plainly but adequately. Flour, salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal, jarred vegetables from what must have been last summer's garden. "Supper's your own to make tonight," he said. "I expect you know how." "We know how," Adeline said. He nodded. He seemed about to leave, and then he stopped, with his hand on the kitchen door frame, not looking at them. "There are no locks on any of the doors inside this house. There's a bolt on each of your bedroom doors from the inside, if you want it. You can lock it every night. I won't touch it." Nobody said anything. He went outside. Nora waited until she heard his boots on the porch steps and then said in a low voice, "He could just break it." "He could," Adeline agreed. "So that was a performance." "Maybe." Adeline looked at the pantry, at the jars of green beans and tomatoes and pickled beets lined up on the shelf with more order than everything else in the kitchen suggested. Someone had put those there carefully. Someone had thought about it. Or maybe not. I don't know yet. "I don't trust him," Nora said. "You're not supposed to yet." Adeline pulled her coat off and hung it on the hook by the door. "Come on, let's feed Lucy something before she starts crying again." Well, the first week was the kind of difficult that comes from not knowing the rules of a place, where things were kept, what was expected, what the man who owned the house considered acceptable, and what he didn't. They learned by watching him and by making mistakes, and by the particular education of living in close quarters with a stranger. Gideon Hale woke before sunrise every morning. They could hear him, the creak of his boots on the floorboards, the clank of the stove being stoked, the door opening and closing as he went out to tend the horses before first light. He cooked his own breakfast at first, a habit of solitary living that he seemed to forget gradually over the first several days, until one morning Adeline simply got up early and started cooking before he did, and he came in from the barn to find eggs and coffee on the table and sat down without comment and ate. He said thank you, just that, no fuss about it. After breakfast he laid out what he expected, not harshly. He sat across the kitchen table from Adeline and Nora with a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote out a list of tasks the same way you'd write out a list for yourself. Chores in the morning, feeding stock, collecting eggs, hauling water from the pump, keeping the wood box filled. After midday, lessons. "What kind of lessons?" Nora said with the tone of someone who'd been disappointed before. "Reading and writing for the little one. Arithmetic for all of you. Bookkeeping. He looked at his list. I'll teach you what I know about running a ranch. What I don't know, I've got books for. Elsie, who had been very quiet since the auction, quieter than usual, which was saying something, looked up from the corner where she'd been sitting. What kind of books? He glanced at her. What kind do you want? She didn't answer. She looked back at her hands. I've got a crate of them in the back room, he said, less to her and more to the table in general. You can go through them. Take what you want. Elsie was gone from the kitchen in under a minute. They heard her in the back room, the sound of a wooden crate being dragged across the floor. Gideon watched the doorway she had disappeared through. Something moved across his face, there and gone, too fast to read. She likes to read? He asked. She likes anything that grows, Adeline said. Plants, animals. She'll read anything that's about either one. He nodded slowly, like he was noting it down somewhere internal. The first real argument happened on the fourth day, and it was Nora who started it, which was not a surprise to anyone who knew Nora. He'd asked her to muck out the horse stalls, which was an unpleasant job and a fair one. Everyone had unpleasant jobs on a working ranch, and Nora wasn't being singled out. But he'd asked her in the particular shorthand way of a person who lived alone and had no habit of explaining himself, and Nora had taken it as an order rather than a request, and that distinction mattered to Nora more than almost anything. She did the job. But when she came back in, she planted herself in the kitchen doorway with manure on her boots and straw in her hair and said, I'm not a farmhand. Gideon looked up from the ledger he was working on. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking, which was a habit of his that Adeline was starting to understand was not rudeness, but just the way he thought, slowly and carefully, and without performing it. No, he said finally. You're not. Then don't give me orders like I'm one. Fair enough. He set his pencil down. What would you prefer? Nora blinked. She'd been prepared for resistance, clearly, and his lack of it threw her. I'd prefer you tell me what needs doing and why, not just tell me to do it. That's reasonable, he said. I'll do that. Nora stood there for a moment longer, slightly robbed of her momentum. All right then, she said, and went to take off her boots. Adeline, who had been watching from the other side of the kitchen, waited until Nora was out of earshot and then said, That was easier than I expected. She's right, Gideon said simply, and picked up his pencil again. Adeline thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Done. The lesson started on the sixth day. Gideon was not a natural teacher. He had patience in large quantities, but no instinct for explaining things. A habit of assuming knowledge that wasn't there, and then backing up when he realized it without making anyone feel stupid about it, which was at least something. He taught arithmetic with a bluntness that Adeline appreciated. This is the formula, this is why it works, try it yourself. Lucy's reading was the one that stopped him cold. She truly couldn't. Adeline had known that, had tried to help over the winter at Roland's, but Roland's house had been chaos, and Lucy had been too frightened to sit still long enough to learn anything. When Gideon sat down with her in the primer he dug out of his back room and asked her to read the first line, Lucy sounded out the letters with painful slowness and then looked up at him with the practiced expression of a child bracing for impatience. He didn't show any. He just moved his finger back to the beginning of the line and said, Again. They did it 6 times. By the 6th time, Lucy got through 3 words without stopping, and her whole face changed, a small, surprised brightness like a lamp catching. And Gideon said, Good, that's enough for today, and closed the book without comment, as though it hadn't been a thing worth making a fuss over. Lucy talked about those 3 words at supper. Gideon ate his beans and said nothing, but Adeline noticed he put an extra biscuit on Lucy's plate. 3 weeks in, Adeline found him in the barn after supper on a Tuesday, going over the ranch ledger by lamplight with the focused misery of someone confronting numbers that didn't add up the way he needed them to. He closed the book when she came in, which she noted. I want to know what we're actually doing here, she said. She'd rehearsed this less than she'd intended to because she'd been tired, and it came out plainer than she'd planned. What you want from us. What this is. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. He set the ledger on the workbench beside him. He looked at his hands. Nothing illegal, he said. Nothing... He stopped. started again. The work is real work. The lessons are real. I'm not running a scheme. I don't have some plan I'm keeping from you. Then why? She said. $450 is not nothing. Why us? Why all four of us together? He was quiet again. This time she waited him out. I had a daughter, he said. She'd be about Elsie's age now. She and her mother died of fever 6 years ago, both of them, same week. He said it without theater, without the particular weight people put on grief when they want credit for surviving it. Just said it. I watched what happened in that square and He shook his head slightly. I couldn't. Adeline stood in the lamplight and looked at this man with his working hands and his numbers that didn't add up and his 2 rooms prepared with mismatched quilts. And she thought about everything she'd been trained to be careful of. And then she thought about the cot she'd slept on for 3 weeks in this house, and how no one had come near it in the night, and how he'd sat with Lucy for an hour over 3 words without once showing that he was somewhere else in his head. That's not a reason, she said. Lots of people watched and did nothing. I know. He picked up the ledger again. I don't have a better answer than what I said. She stood there another moment. You should let me look at those numbers, she said. I kept my father's books from the time I was 12. He looked at her. Your father trusted you with his books at 12. He didn't have much choice. He was sick for 2 years before he died. She held out her hand. He considered her for a long moment. Then he handed her the ledger. She found 2 errors and a category of expense he'd been misclassifying for what looked like at least 3 years. She brought it back to him the next morning with the corrections marked in pencil, lightly so he could erase them if he disagreed. And he looked over everything she'd done with the careful attention of someone who wasn't rushing to a conclusion, and then he said, You were right about all 3. I know, she said. He almost smiled. Almost. Spring came gradually and then all at once, the way it does on the prairie, so that one morning you woke up and the yard wasn't frozen anymore, and the dead grass at the creek was starting to show something green at the edges. Elsie discovered the kitchen garden the same morning, or rather, she discovered what had been a kitchen garden before someone had stopped caring for it, which was now mostly bare soil with some aggressive weeds reclaiming the edges. She stood over it with her hands on her hips, and the expression of someone confronting a problem she was already planning how to solve. Can I fix this? She asked Gideon, who happened to be walking past. He stopped and looked at it. Fix it how? Plant it properly. Rotate the beds. I know what I'm doing. My mother taught me. He looked at it again. It was a significant plot, room for a serious kitchen garden if someone managed it well. What would you need? She produced a list from her apron pocket, an actual list written in pencil on a piece of brown paper. Adeline, watching from the porch, laughed so hard she had to sit down, and even Gideon's face did something complicated before he took the list and looked it over. I can get most of this in Caldwell, he said. I need good compost from the barn, Elsie said. Not the horse stalls, the old pile in the corner, the one that's been sitting. You know about composting. My mother knew about everything that grows. Elsie said it matter-of-factly, not sadly, though maybe there was something under the matter-of-fact if you listened carefully. I paid attention. He handed the list back. The garden's yours. Don't let the beans crowd the squash again. Whoever planted it last made a mess of the spacing. He walked away. Elsie looked at the plot, then back at his retreating figure, then at Adeline on the porch. Did he just give me the whole garden? Looks like, Adeline said. Elsie turned back to the plot with the expression of someone who had just been handed a very specific and significant gift, and Adeline watched her and thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that the people who'd put them on that auction platform had been spectacularly wrong about what 4 frightened girls were worth. It was Nora who noticed it first, the way Gideon's hands shook sometimes in the early morning, before coffee, before his body had remembered the day. Not badly, just a tremor that came and went. She mentioned it to Adeline one night in their room, with the door bolted. It's not drink, Nora said, with the flat certainty of someone who had watched Roland Mercer carefully for months and knew exactly what a drinker's hands looked like. It's something else. He's got a cough too, Adeline said. I've heard it at night. He's not well. No, Adeline said. I don't think he is. They lay in the dark for a while. Outside, a coyote was calling somewhere far off, and the horses shifted in the barn, and the stove settled with a tick and a groan. "If he dies," Nora said, in the direct way she had of saying things that other people danced around, "what happens to us?" "I don't know," Adeline said. "We should find out." "I know." She didn't ask him the next day. She wasn't sure yet how, but she started paying more attention to the cough, to the ledger, to the way he sometimes came back from riding fences looking more tired than the distance warranted. She watched, and she thought, and she kept the information in that place she'd learned to keep important things, back far enough not to panic over, close enough not to forget. The bookkeeping lessons became something else over the weeks that followed. Longer, more specific, more like a conversation between two people who were both actually thinking rather than a teacher and a student performing their roles. He taught her how he tracked cattle inventory, which was imprecise because cattle moved and died, and the numbers were always approximate. He taught her how he estimated feed costs against expected winter length, which involved a kind of weather intuition built from years on the plains that he couldn't fully explain, but tried to translate into rules she could apply. He taught her how he negotiated with buyers in Caldwell and with the railroad agent who came through twice a year. And he taught her that knowing the number you wouldn't go below before you walked into a negotiation was the most important thing you could know. "What's yours?" she asked once. "The number you wouldn't go below," he told her. She was surprised by how low it was. "You're not covering your labor cost," she said. "I know." "So why?" "Because if I push higher and they walk, I've got no cash until spring." He looked at the window. "I've been in a bad negotiating position for 3 years. That's why the books don't add up." 3 years is when your wife and daughter died," she said. He didn't answer that. He pointed at the ledger and said, "Show me where you'd change the projection for the fall." She showed him. He didn't agree with all of it, and they argued about 2 of the numbers, and she was right about 1, and he was right about the other, and neither of them acknowledged that the arguing was itself something, that 2 people who'd started as stranger and purchased property were sitting at a table treating each other's reasoning as worth pushing against. Nora found her role with the horses, which no one planned or suggested. It simply happened, the way her roles always happened, by Nora identifying something that needed doing and doing it before anyone could stop her. One of the mares, a gray Gideon called Pewter, had a stone bruise in her left front hoof that was making her favorite. He'd been managing it slowly, with more patience than time. Nora watched him work on it one afternoon, then watched again the next, and then on the 3rd day she showed up with her sleeves rolled up and asked if she could try. He looked at her. "You know horses?" "I know how to watch," she said, "and I've been watching you for 3 days." He stepped back and let her try. She got it wrong the first time. Not badly, but wrong. And he corrected her without drama, just moved her hand to the right position, and she tried again, and the second time she felt the bruise location under her fingers, and Pewter shifted her weight in a way that said there without words. "There," Nora said. "There," he agreed. After that, the horses became Nora's, at least in the way that things become yours when you're the one who shows up for them every day. She didn't soften, exactly. She remained herself, skeptical and direct and occasionally combative, but her edges went somewhere else when she was in the barn, something in her body settling that didn't settle anywhere else. Gideon noticed. He said nothing about it for weeks, and then one morning he said to Adeline in passing, "Your sister has good hands with animals." Adeline told Nora. Nora said, "I know," and went back to brushing Pewter, but something in her shoulders shifted in a way that was either satisfaction or relief, or something in between that didn't have a clean name. Lucy learned to read. It happened over 6 weeks of daily work, letter by letter, and then word by word. And then, one Thursday afternoon, when the kitchen smelled like the cornbread Adeline had been teaching herself to make properly, Lucy read an entire page of the primer without stopping. She read it aloud at the table while Gideon checked the afternoon numbers, and Elsie sorted through the seeds she'd saved from the first planting. And when she finished, she looked up with that lamp-catching brightness that had been growing steadily brighter since the first time she'd gotten 3 words right. "I read it," she said. "The whole thing." "You did," Gideon said, without looking up from his numbers. "Did you hear me?" "I heard every word." He turned a page in his ledger. What does the next page say? Lucy opened her mouth and closed it. She looked at the book. Then she turned the page and started reading. Adeline sat across the table and kept her eyes on the cornbread she was checking through the oven door, and did not let any of what she was feeling show on her face, because some things were private, and this was one of them. The particular weight of watching your smallest sister, who had spent the worst winter of her life too frightened to learn anything, read a full page of words in a warm kitchen. She checked the bread. She counted to 10. She let it be what it was. By the time April had deepened into something that looked like actual spring, green at the creek, mud in the yard instead of ice, Elsie's kitchen garden showing its first determined rows of seedlings, the Mercer sisters had been at Thornridge Ranch for just over 2 months. They had not been hurt. They had not been cheated. They had been given work and lessons and an accounting of what was expected that, however imperfect and sometimes awkward, had been given honestly. Adeline had not stopped watching Gideon Hale. She wasn't sure she ever would, entirely. That was a habit built by necessity, and she didn't think it would leave on schedule. But she'd moved from watching for threat to watching out of something closer to curiosity, and that was a longer distance than it sounded. He was not what she'd expected. He was not warm, exactly. He didn't tell stories or make easy conversation or remember to ask how they were doing in any consistent way. He forgot things. Forgot to tell them about the neighbor who came by to buy hay and seemed startled by 4 girls in the yard. Forgot to mention that the well handle needed to be pumped twice before the water came. Forgot once to mention that the large dog liked to steal food off low tables if you turned your back. Lucy learned that last one the hard way, and Gideon spent 10 minutes apologizing for it, which was more words strung together than she'd heard from him in any previous single sitting. And Lucy forgave him almost immediately because the dog's expression of satisfaction was, as Lucy put it, too funny to stay mad at. He was not what she'd expected, but she was beginning to suspect that what she'd expected had been built from the wrong materials, fear and experience with men who had reasons to hide things. Gideon Hale hid things, she was certain of it, but not the kind that bit. What he was hiding, she thought, was simpler and heavier than that. He was hiding how much it cost him, still, to be here, to be in this house with people in it, to have the sound of children eating breakfast and a dog stealing food and boots left by the door, when for 6 years there had been nothing but silence and numbers that didn't add up. She didn't know how to speak to that yet. She wasn't sure it was hers to speak to, but she noticed it in the careful way she noticed everything, and she kept it close, and she waited to understand what it meant. Outside, Elsie's seedlings grew in their careful rows. Lucy's primer sat open to page 12 on the kitchen table. The horses, including Pewter, who no longer favored her left foot, moved in the paddock in the last of the afternoon light. The numbers in the ranch ledger, slowly, were beginning to make sense. Nothing was fixed. Nothing was done. Gideon's hand still shook in the mornings, and his cough hadn't gone anywhere, and Roland Mercer's name still sat in the back of Adeline's mind like a stone that hadn't stopped being a stone just because she'd set it down. But for the first time in longer than she could cleanly remember, the next morning felt like something other than a threat. That wasn't nothing. That, in fact, was quite a lot. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in late May, which was otherwise a good day. Elsie's bean rows had come up straight and strong. Lucy had read her first full chapter without help, and Adeline had finished a revised projection for the fall cattle sale that she was quietly proud of. It was the kind of day that made you lower your guard, which was probably why the letter hit as hard as it did. Gideon brought it in from town without preamble, set it on the kitchen table in front of Adeline, and stood back. His face told her nothing. It never told her much, but this was a particular kind of nothing. The careful blankness of a man who had already read what was inside and was waiting to see what she'd do with it. The envelope was from a law office in Caldwell. R. Hatch and Associates. The same gray suit from the auction square. She remembered the name now. Hatch, sewn in small letters on the leather satchel he'd been carrying. She opened it. She read it twice. Then she set it flat on the table and put both hands on the edge of the wood and breathed. "He's suing," she said. "Yes." "He's claiming the auction was fraudulent, that you manipulated the sale." "Yes." "Did you?" Gideon looked at her with the expression of a man who'd decided, some time ago, not to be offended by reasonable questions. "No," he said. "Then what does he actually have? That's what I need to figure out." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. Hatch is good. He found a clause in the territorial debt code that says a guardian may petition to have a settlement vacated if there's evidence the bidding process was irregular. Roland is claiming I made a private arrangement with Grady before the auction. Did you? I knew Grady from a cattle sale 3 years ago. We spoke the morning of the auction. I told him I intended to bid on all 4 of you together and that I'd be paying cash. Adeline stared at him. That's it? That's all? And Hatch is going to call that collusion. He's going to try. She pushed the letter aside and thought about it. From the back room, she could hear Lucy sounding out words to herself, a habit she'd developed, practicing even when no one was listening, and Elsie's boots on the back porch steps coming in from the garden, and the specific quality of afternoon quiet on a ranch that has people in it. If he wins, she said. It wasn't a question exactly. If he wins, the court vacates the sale. I lose what I paid. You go back to Roland's custody. He paused. Unless the court decides Roland himself is unfit, which would require a separate proceeding. He burned through everything our parents built in less than a year. That's neglect, possibly. Not legally unfit in the territory's current definition. Hatch knows that. Adeline sat with all of it for a long moment. Outside the window, the bean rows stood in the afternoon light, neat and green and completely indifferent to what was happening in the kitchen. When is the hearing? She asked. 6 weeks. Then we have 6 weeks, she said. She told the others that evening after supper, while Gideon was in the barn doing the last check on the horses. She'd asked him for the room deliberately, and he'd understood without her having to say so, which she noted. Nora's reaction was what she'd expected. Immediate, cold fury, the kind that goes very still and very quiet. She sat at the table for a full minute without speaking, which for Nora was as close to speechless as she ever got. Elsie's reaction was different. She said, "Can he actually win?" "I don't know," Adeline said, "but it's possible." "Yes, it's possible." Elsie nodded once, looking at her hands, the ones with the dirt still under the fingernails from the garden. "Then we can't let it happen." "No." Lucy, who had understood enough to understand the shape of it, if not all the details, said, "I don't want to go back." "I know," Adeline said. "Uncle Roland smells like the back of a saloon." "I know. And he never once asked if we were hungry." Adeline reached across the table and put her hand over Lucy's. She didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say about that wouldn't make it worse. She just left her hand there. Nora finally spoke. "What does Gideon need us to do?" "He hasn't said." "Then we should ask him." "I will," Adeline said. "Tomorrow, Mom." The conversation happened in the barn the following morning, early, before chores, while Nora was still asleep and Elsie was already out checking the garden. Adeline found Gideon forking hay into Pewter's stall and waited until he turned around. "I want to testify," she said. He set the fork against the wall. "You're 15. I know how old I am. The court may not give much weight." "We were there," she said. "We were on that platform. We know exactly what happened before, during, and after that auction. We know what Roland did with our parents' money, and we know what our lives were in his house, and we know what they've been here." She stopped. "You hired a lawyer?" "Sent a wire to a man named Cowboy in Wichita. He's good. He's coming next week. When he comes, I want to speak with him." Gideon studied her with that particular assessment of his that never quite felt like judgment, more like calculation, in the neutral sense, the same way he looked at ledger columns and weather patterns. "You're sure about this?" "I'm sure that if we lose because we stayed quiet when we had something true to say, I won't be able to live with it." He was quiet for long enough that a sparrow moved into the barn, pecked at something near the door, and left again. "All right," he said. "All 4 of us. Nora will want to. Elsie probably will too. Lucy's too young, I think. She doesn't need to be in that room." Agreed on Lucy. "And Gideon." She waited until he was looking at her directly. "Don't hide anything from Calloway. Whatever passed between you and Grady that morning, whatever you said to whom, all of it. Hatch is going to find the version that sounds worst. Your lawyer needs the true version before Hatch presents his." He nodded. Nothing in his face told her whether being talked to this way by a 15-year-old bothered him. She'd stopped worrying about that a while back. Cuts. Calloway arrived on a Tuesday, a lean, fast-talking man from Wichita with ink-stained fingers and a leather briefcase that was visibly overfull, papers threatening to escape every time he unlatched it. He was not particularly warm and he was not particularly gentle, but he was fiercely intelligent in the way of someone who found the law genuinely interesting, like a puzzle he couldn't put down. He interviewed Gideon first, alone, for 2 hours. Then he asked to speak with Adeline. He looked at her across the kitchen table the same way she imagined he looked at evidence, with attention, without assumptions. "Tell me about the auction," he said. "From the beginning. Everything you remember." She told him. All of it. Deputy Cole's face, Grady's papers, the bidders and what they'd said and how they'd said it, Roland's position near the auctioneer, the specific words Gideon had used when he'd stepped forward. Calloway wrote in shorthand without looking at the page, his eyes on her the entire time. When she was finished, he said, "You're going to do well in court." "I'm not trying to do well. I'm trying to tell the truth." "I know. That's why you're going to do well." He tapped his pencil on the table. Hatch is going to try to establish that Gideon's prior relationship with Grady constitutes improper influence. The fact that he told Grady his bidding intentions before the sale began is the heart of their case. Is that actually illegal? In the strict reading of the debt settlement code? Arguably irregular. But I found 2 prior cases in the territory where similar pre-auction communications were deemed acceptable. The problem is the judge. What about the judge? Calloway set his pencil down. Judge Harlan Whitmore. He's been on the territorial bench for 11 years. He's not corrupt, but he's conservative. He follows the letter of statutes closely, and he doesn't like gray areas. Then we need him to see this isn't a gray area, Adeline said. That's precisely the argument I intend to make. He looked at her with something that might have been appreciation if he'd been a warmer man. I'd like Nora in the courtroom as well. Is she? She'll be ready, Adeline said. The 6 weeks before the hearing were the longest of Adeline's life, which was saying something given the year she'd had. Calloway came twice more. Gideon spent 3 evenings going over testimony with Adeline and Nora at the kitchen table, not coaching them on what to say. He was careful about that, and Calloway had been explicit, but helping them think through how to say true things clearly and without being rattled. Hatch will try to confuse you, Gideon said one evening, a lamp burning between them. He's going to ask the same question in 5 different ways and hope that you contradict yourself. Then I'll say the same thing 5 different ways, Nora said. That's exactly right. I've dealt with men who try to confuse on purpose, Nora said. She didn't elaborate and she didn't need to. Roland Mercer had been exactly that kind of man. Questions designed to make you doubt what you'd seen, what you'd heard, what you knew. Nora had 12 years of practice at not being moved by it. Something shifted in Gideon's expression, a tightness that wasn't quite anger, something older than anger. I'm sorry you had that practice, he said. Nora looked at him. It was one of the more direct things he'd ever said to her, and she seemed unsure what to do with it. She looked back at her hands. Don't be sorry, she said finally. It's useful now. They drove into Caldwell the morning of the hearing in Gideon's wagon, all 5 of them, which was the first time they'd been back since the auction. The town looked the same storefronts, the same street, the same square where the platform still stood. Someone had used it for a farm equipment sale in April, Adeline had heard. Life going on around the worst things, the way it always does. The territorial courthouse was a 2-story stone building on the north end of the square. People were already gathered outside when they arrived, more than Adeline had expected. Word had gotten around the way it does in small territories where a debt auction involving children was still fresh enough to be uncomfortable for everyone who'd watched. She saw Mrs. Pratt near the courthouse steps. The milliner saw her too, and something complicated happened on the woman's face. Guilt, maybe, or something trying to be resolution. Adeline looked away. Calloway was waiting on the courthouse steps with his overfull briefcase and an expression that was as close to reassurance as she suspected he ever got. Good, he said when he saw them. All of you look like people who are telling the truth. That matters more than most people realize. Because we are telling the truth, Nora said. Exactly, he said, as though this were a remarkable and useful coincidence. The courtroom was packed. There were maybe 60 people in the gallery, which for a weekday in a territorial courthouse was a significant crowd. The room itself was plain. Wooden benches, a raised bench for the judge, two tables facing it. Hatch was already at the plaintiff's table, sorting papers with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed he had this managed. Roland Mercer sat beside him. He was wearing a suit that was too good for his current finances, which meant he'd borrowed for it or stolen it, and he'd made an effort with his hair. He looked, Adeline thought, like a man performing the role of wronged guardian for an audience he'd identified and was playing to. He caught her eye as they walked in. He didn't look away. He held her gaze with the particular expression of a man who has decided that being looked at directly is itself a form of dominance. Adeline looked away first, not because she was intimidated, but because she had nothing to prove to Roland Mercer by staring at him, and she needed her attention somewhere more useful. Nora looked at him for considerably longer and then sat down. Judge Whitmore entered at 9 exactly. A compact man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and the demeanor of someone who had been told enough stories in courtrooms to have become skeptical of all of them. He called the session to order and looked at the room over his glasses with the efficient attention of a man who already knew what he thought and was waiting to be corrected. Hatch opened for the plaintiff with the smooth confidence of a man who had done this many times. He outlined Roland Mercer's position with selective precision. A legal guardian, he said, who had found himself in financial difficulty through no fault of his own, who had reluctantly pursued the only legal remedy available to settle debts he'd not personally incurred, and whose custody rights had been subverted by a private arrangement between the defendant and the auctioneer. He made it sound almost reasonable. Adeline watched the judge's face and could not read it, which frightened her more than hostility would have. Calloway's opening was shorter and less elegant, which Adeline suspected was a choice. He laid out the facts without flourish. The auction had proceeded according to established procedure. The bid had exceeded the debt. The transaction had been completed lawfully, and the petitioner's claim rested entirely on a preliminary conversation whose content did not constitute improper influence under any prior territorial ruling. He cited both cases he'd found. The judge's pen moved twice. Then the witnesses. Grady, the auctioneer, testified first. He was visibly uncomfortable, a broad man folded into a witness chair that was slightly too small, his hat turning in his hands. Under Hatch's questioning, he confirmed that Gideon had spoken with him before the auction began. "And what did he tell you?" Hatch asked. "That he intended to bid on all 4 of the Mercer girls together, and that he had cash on him. Did he ask you to do anything? To conduct the bidding in any particular way?" Grady hesitated. "He asked me to make sure they weren't separated. If bids came in for them individual, he said to make sure I called for any bids on all 4 together before closing." A murmur through the gallery. Hatch let it settle. "So he asked you to structure the bidding process to benefit his preferred outcome." "He asked me to give the altogether option a fair chance," Grady said, "that's within my discretion as auctioneer." "Within your discretion," Hatch repeated, "or outside standard procedure." Grady looked at the floor. "I don't know that there's a standard for that exact situation." Calloway's cross-examination was brief. He established that Grady had not agreed to set a minimum price, had not agreed to reject other bids, had conducted the auction publicly and openly, and had accepted the highest legitimate bid. Nothing had been hidden. Nothing had been prevented. One man had asked another to give a certain kind of bid the opportunity to be heard, and it had been heard, and it had won. "Is that collusion, in your understanding?" Calloway asked. "Objection," Hatch said. "I'll rephrase," Calloway said without missing a beat. "In your 15 years of conducting auctions in this territory, have you ever had a prospective bidder approach you before a sale to explain their intentions?" Grady thought about it. "Yes, several times." "Did you consider those conversations improper?" "No." "No further questions. But..." Roland took the stand after the midday recess. He had rehearsed, Adeline could tell. His answers were too smooth, too shaped, missing the irregular edges that real memory has. He described himself as a man overwhelmed by grief and debt, driven to a painful decision by impossible circumstances. He described the auction as something he'd participated in reluctantly, under legal advice. He described his desire to regain custody as coming from family feeling, from obligation, from love. When Calloway rose for cross, he stood very still for a moment, looking at Roland with the expression of a man reading a document for errors. "Mr. Mercer," he said. Can you describe the condition of your nieces when they arrived in your custody following the death of their father? It was a difficult time. Were they adequately fed? A pause. I did my best. Were they adequately clothed for the winter? I had financial difficulties. Mr. Mercer, in the 14 months your nieces were in your care, did you once inquire about enrolling them in the county school? Roland's jaw tightened. I intended to. Did you once contact the county welfare office regarding support available for orphan dependents in your situation? I wasn't aware. You were not aware, Calloway said, of the county welfare provision for guardians of orphaned children, even though that provision was publicly posted in the Caldwell County Clerk's office during the entire period in question. Hatch objected. Whitmore overruled him. Calloway let the silence sit for a moment before he continued. You've described your motivation to regain custody as love for your nieces. Can you tell the court, what is the youngest niece's name? Roland blinked. It's Lucy. How old is she? The pause was just long enough. 6, Roland said. She'll be 7 in August, Calloway said. Her birthday is the 14th. I'd ask the court to note that this information was provided to me by the child herself, who was able to tell me immediately. He looked at Roland for one more moment. No further questions. Adeline testified in the afternoon. Walking to the witness chair felt like the longest short distance she'd ever crossed. The courtroom was very quiet. She could feel 60 pairs of eyes, and she focused on Calloway's face, which was the thing she'd decided to look at. Not Roland, not Hatch, not the gallery. She told the truth. She told it clearly and in order, the way Gideon had helped her think through. Not rushing, not performing, just saying what had happened as precisely as she could remember it. She talked about her parents' ranch. She talked about the 14 months in Roland's house. Not dramatically, just accurately. The cold and the hunger and the fear that was low grade and constant, the kind you stop noticing after a while because it's just the air you breathe. She talked about the auction and what it had felt like to stand on that platform and look at a crowd of 40 people who watched in silence. Then Hatch crossed. He was careful with her in a way that told her he'd assessed the risk of being rough with a teenage girl in a packed courtroom. He came in at angles, which was what Gideon had said he'd do. You've described life at the Hale Ranch in very favorable terms, he said. I've described it accurately. You're 15 years old, Miss Mercer. You've been at this ranch for less than 3 months. Isn't it possible you're not yet able to fully evaluate whether this situation truly serves your welfare? She looked at him. I kept my father's business books from the age of 12 through his illness and death. I managed a household for 4 through a winter under my uncle's roof, which meant I learned what it looked like when an adult in charge of you didn't consider you a priority. And I've spent 3 months on Thorn Ridge Ranch where I've been given work, education, fair treatment, and the first real accounting of what was expected of me since my father died. She paused. I'm 15, not 5. And I'm answering your question directly. The gallery stirred. Whitmore looked over his glasses but didn't call order. Hatch changed direction. You said Mr. Hale has been teaching you bookkeeping, ranch management. Yes. Don't you find it unusual that a man would invest that kind of time and education in children he purchased? He didn't purchase us, Adeline said. He paid a debt. There's a difference. In reality, she said, which is what I'm testifying about. Hatch looked at his papers. He tried 2 more angles and got similar results from both, and then he sat down. Nora testified after Adeline, and she was something to watch. She had none of Adeline's careful precision. She was direct and flat and immovable in the way of a 12-year-old who had decided she was not going to be bent, and her testimony was short, and it was devastating. When Hatch asked her whether she considered Gideon Hale a proper guardian, she said, He taught me how to care for horses. He told me why things needed doing, not just that they did. He didn't hit us, and he didn't starve us, and he didn't lock us in, and he didn't sell our parents' things for gambling money. Miss Mercer, that's not what I... You asked if I considered him proper, Nora said. I'm telling you what proper looks like from where I've been standing. Whitmore did not call her down for it. The last witness of the day was Gideon himself. He was not a dramatic witness. He answered questions without elaboration, without performing humility or heroism. without trying to make himself sympathetic. He confirmed the conversation with Grady. He confirmed the amount he'd paid. He confirmed that he'd prepared rooms before the auction, which Hatch tried to characterize as evidence of premeditation and which Calloway reframed as evidence of intent to provide proper housing. When Hatch asked him why 4 girls he'd never met, why that auction, why spend money a struggling ranch couldn't easily spare, Gideon was quiet for a long moment. "Because I could," he said finally, "and because I've known what it looks like when nobody does anything. I've been in a crowd that watched and said nothing, and I didn't want to be that again." Hatch looked like he'd hoped for more to work with. "That's your reason? An emotional reaction?" "I suppose," Gideon said. "I'd call it a decision, but I don't imagine the difference matters much to you." Hatch had no more questions. Whitmore called a recess and then said he would deliberate and return his ruling within 3 days. The courtroom emptied with the slow, reluctant movement of people who'd come hoping for resolution and been given waiting instead. Outside on the courthouse steps, the late afternoon sun was low and orange across the square. Adeline stood for a moment looking at the platform at the far end. The same wood, the same post, the settlement sign long taken down, but the nail holes still visible. Lucy appeared at her side and slid her hand into Adeline's, which had been Lucy's solution to most things since she was old enough to understand that hands were useful. "Do you think we'll win?" Lucy asked. Adeline looked at the platform. She thought about Calloway's 2 cases and Nora's face in the witness chair and the way Whitmore's pen had moved when certain things were said. "I think we told the truth," she said. "And I think the truth was good." "That's not the same as yes." "No?" Adeline said. "It's not." Lucy squeezed her hand. They stood there in the orange afternoon light on the courthouse steps, waiting for Gideon to come out, watching the square where everything had started, and the wind moved across the prairie the way it always did, indifferent and constant, not caring at all what the judge decided. That was the hardest part. The world would keep going either way. So they stood, and they waited, and they held on. The 3 days Whitmore had asked for stretched into 4, and then 5, and by the 6th morning, Adeline had stopped pretending she wasn't counting. She kept herself busy because that was the only thing that worked. The ledger, the garden, the lessons, the horses. She moved through the ranch's daily rhythms with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that the mind left idle will eat itself. But at night, in the room she shared with Nora, with the bolt drawn and the stove ticking down to coals, she lay awake and ran the courtroom through her head the way you run a calculation you're not certain of. Looking for the error, the thing you missed, the moment that might have gone differently. Nora slept. That was one of Nora's gifts, maybe her most enviable one. She could set a thing down when the day was over and not pick it back up until morning. Adeline had never been able to do that. On the 5th night, she heard Gideon's cough from across the house, worse than usual, the kind that went on long enough to make her sit up in bed and count the seconds until it stopped. It stopped. She lay back down. She stared at the ceiling. She thought about what Calloway had said when they'd left the courthouse, quietly, just to her and Gideon, while Nora was getting Lucy settled in the wagon. "I've done everything the law gives us to do. The rest is the judge." He'd said it without apology or false comfort, which she'd appreciated and hated in equal measure. The rest is the judge, as though all of it, the platform, the cold spring morning, the 30 miles north, the bean rows and the primer and the bookkeeping and the cough she lay awake listening to, all of it balanced on the opinion of a compact man with steel gray hair who'd been told enough stories to be skeptical of all of them. She was still awake when the first gray light came through the window. She got up and started the stove. All right. Calloway's wire arrived on the 7th day, mid-morning, while Elsie was in the garden, and Lucy was at the kitchen table with her reader, and Nora was in the barn with Pewter. Gideon brought it in from town without having told them he was going, which meant he'd slipped out early and ridden in and back before anyone noticed, which told Adeline he'd been as incapable of waiting as she had. He set the wire on the table. Lucy looked up from her book. Adeline read it. Whitmore issues ruling Friday 9 a.m. All parties required present. Calloway. "What does it say?" Lucy asked. "That we need to be in Caldwell on Friday." Lucy looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze she'd been developing lately, the one that saw more than 6-year-olds were supposed to see. Is that good or bad? It means he made a decision, Adeline said. That's all it means right now. She folded the wire and put it in her apron pocket and went to find Nora. Friday arrived the way important days always do. Ordinary on the surface, the same light through the same window, the same sounds from the barn, the same smell of wood smoke and coffee. The difference was interior, a tightness that sat just below the sternum that Adeline had learned not to let show because showing it accomplished nothing. They dressed carefully, not in their best. They didn't have best exactly, but they wore what was cleanest, and Adeline braided Lucy's hair and Nora's and did her own as neatly as she could manage without a good mirror. Gideon wore the same coat he'd worn to the auction, the good one that wasn't new, and he drove them to Caldwell in silence that was not uncomfortable, but was dense with the weight of everything not being said. The courthouse was even more crowded than it had been for the hearing. People stood along the back wall and in the doorway when the gallery filled. Adeline recognized faces she hadn't expected: the rancher who'd bought cattle from her father, 2 women from the dry goods store, Deputy Cole in the back corner, looking like a man who had invested more in this outcome than his official position required. Roland was at the plaintiff's table with Hatch. He was not wearing the borrowed suit this time. He was in his ordinary clothes, which was either a tactical choice or an indication of what he was spending money on instead of lawyers. Hatch looked perfectly composed. He always looked perfectly composed, which was probably useful in his profession and infuriating to everyone around him. Calloway was already at the defense table, papers arranged in a precise row that was the most organized Adeline had ever seen his materials. He looked up when they came in and gave a small nod that told her nothing useful. They took their seats. Lucy sat between Adeline and Elsie, which was where she'd been at the original hearing too, and she held both their hands with the grip of someone preparing for a wave. Whitmore entered at 9 exactly, same as before. He settled himself at the bench, looked at his papers, looked at the room, and then looked at no one in particular as he began to speak. His voice was the same flat, deliberate instrument it had always been. He did not build to his conclusion. He was not that kind of man, apparently, not interested in theater. He stated his findings in the order he'd reached them, which meant they had to sit through the procedural analysis before they got to the thing that mattered. He found, first, that the preliminary conversation between Gideon Hale and auctioneer Grady did not constitute improper influence under territorial statute, citing the same 2 precedent cases Calloway had found, plus a third that Adeline suspected Whitmore had located himself. He found that the bidding had proceeded openly and that no evidence existed of any agreement to suppress or manipulate competing bids. He found the transaction lawfully completed. That was the procedural part. Roland's jaw was tight. Hatch's pen had stopped moving. Then Whitmore looked up from his papers for the first time and addressed the courtroom directly, and something in his voice changed. Not dramatically, but enough. The flat deliberateness sharpened into something with more heat behind it. This court has heard testimony from 3 minor children regarding their circumstances under their legal guardian's care prior to the auction proceeding, he said. This court has also reviewed the petition's claim that Mr. Roland Mercer seeks return of custody out of familial concern for said minors. He paused. This court finds that claim unsupported by evidence and contradicted substantially by testimony. The gallery was very still. Furthermore, Whitmore continued, this court finds that the minor children's welfare is materially and demonstrably better served by their current arrangement than by any return to the petitioner's custody. Mr. Hale's guardianship is hereby affirmed. The petition is denied in full. Roland's chair scraped the floor. Hatch put a hand on his arm. Mr. Mercer retains no legal claim to the persons or custody of his nieces. Any future petition on this matter will require substantially new evidence to be considered by this court. Whitmore looked directly at Roland for the first time. His expression had none of the neutrality of the procedural sections. I would counsel the petitioner against the expenditure. And then he said the thing that nobody in the room had expected. He set his papers down on the bench and took his glasses off and held them in one hand. And he looked at the gallery the way a man looks at something he's been thinking about for longer than the case in front of him. This proceeding has required this court to operate within the boundaries of existing territorial statute regarding debt settlement and minor custody. Those boundaries are, in this court's considered opinion, inadequate. He wasn't reading now. The practice of settling private financial debts through the auction of miners' labor and persons is, at minimum, a profound failure of this territory's obligation to its most vulnerable residents. At most, it is something this court will not name aloud in front of children, but which every adult in this room understands. Not a sound from 60 people. This court will be filing a formal recommendation to the territorial legislature that the relevant statutes be reviewed and amended. I would encourage any member of this community who shares that view to make it known to their representatives. He put his glasses back on. We're adjourned. The gavel came down. Cool. What happened next was not cinematic. There was no moment of collective exhale, no rising of the room into celebration. What happened was more like the particular confused relief of people who had braced for impact and were now figuring out what to do with their bodies now that impact hadn't come. Lucy started crying. Quietly, with her face pressed into Adeline's sleeve, the same hiccuping cry from the auction morning, but different now, the sound of pressure releasing rather than pressure building. Adeline held her and looked at the front of the room and did not cry, because she was still too busy understanding what had just happened. Nora stood up. She stood up straight with her hands at her sides and looked at Roland Mercer across the room for a long moment. Roland met her eyes briefly, then looked away. He said something to Hatch in a low voice, and Hatch responded in the tone of a lawyer explaining that the account had been settled and the work was done and the bill would follow. Roland left without looking at the girls. Not with dignity, he simply left. The exit of a man who had run out of moves and wanted to be somewhere else before anyone looked at him too hard. Calloway was shaking Gideon's hand when Adeline reached them. He said something about the recommendation to the legislature being an unexpected development, said it with the controlled surprise of a man recalibrating his assessment of Judge Whitmore upward. Gideon thanked him, briefly, and with the awkward sincerity of someone who doesn't express gratitude easily. Calloway said he'd send the final paperwork, and that was largely that. He was already thinking about his next case, Adeline could tell, already somewhere else. She respected that about him. She looked at Gideon. He was looking at the bench where Whitmore had been, now empty, the judge having disappeared through the back door with the efficient disappearance of someone who had said what he'd come to say. "It's over," she said. "This part," he said. She understood the distinction. Some things ending didn't mean nothing was left. Bosh. The drive back to the ranch was different from every other time they'd made it. The difference wasn't dramatic. The prairie was still the prairie, flat and immense in the June heat, the grass green now instead of the dead brown of their first drive north. But Lucy talked the entire way, narrating her relief in the exhaustive detail only 6-year-olds can sustain. And Elsie had her face turned up to the sky with her eyes half closed, and Nora sat with her arms crossed, and her jaw set, and something complicated moving behind her eyes that was not quite happiness, and not quite grief, but somewhere in the particular territory between the two, where you end up when something you were afraid of doesn't happen. Gideon drove. He didn't talk, which was normal. But once, on a long empty stretch, where the road ran straight for a mile and there was nothing requiring his attention, he turned his head slightly and looked back at the 4 of them in the wagon bed, just for a moment, before facing forward again. Adeline noticed. She always noticed. The educator arrived in August. Her name was Margaret Ashcroft, and she came to the ranch's attention through a notice Adeline had found tacked to the Caldwell post office board while picking up mail. A teacher seeking a residential position, experienced in advanced instruction, references available. Adeline had taken the notice down and brought it home and put it on the kitchen table without comment. And Gideon had read it and asked what she thought, and she'd said she thought it was worth a letter. Margaret Ashcroft was not what Adeline had pictured from the notice. She was perhaps 40, with direct gray eyes and the kind of posture that communicated she had spent most of her adult life in classrooms and had opinions about how they should be run. She arrived by wagon from Caldwell with 2 trunks and a crate of books and an expression that assessed the ranch with the frank efficiency of a woman who had been lied to about living conditions before and was checking for discrepancies between description and reality. She found fewer than she'd expected, apparently, because she stayed. Gideon negotiated her wage at the kitchen table while Adeline sat in the corner with the ledger, which Margaret noticed immediately. She asked who kept the books. Gideon said Adeline did. Margaret looked at Adeline with a revised expression, the specific recalibration of someone who has just received information that changes their assessment of a situation. "What's your arithmetic level?" she asked. "I can do most of what comes up in ranch accounting," Adeline said. "I don't know what I don't know." Margaret smiled, which was a precise and not particularly warm expression, but was clearly genuine. "That's the most honest answer I've gotten to that question in 20 years of teaching." She started the following Monday. The lessons changed. Not in the way of replacing what Gideon had been doing. He continued his own instruction. The practical knowledge of the ranch, the numbers and negotiations, and the accumulated weather reading and animal knowing that came from decades of frontier life. What Margaret added was the other architecture, the wider frame that Adeline hadn't known was missing until it was suddenly there. She taught them literature with the conviction that stories were technology, tools for understanding situations you hadn't lived yet. She taught them history as argument, showing how the same events had been interpreted differently by people with different stakes in the interpretation and why that mattered. She taught them basic law and economics with a plainness that the subject rarely got, stripped of the language that made it feel inaccessible. Lucy took to literature the way Elsie had taken to the garden, with a complete and consuming absorption that left no room for anything else when it had her. She read things above her comprehension and understood more of them than she should have. And when she didn't understand, she asked Margaret questions that made Margaret stop and rethink her answers, which Margaret did not seem to mind. Elsie's education became specific and technical in the way that suited her. Margaret found a correspondence course through a Kansas City agricultural college and helped Elsie enroll, which meant papers arriving in the mail and papers going back out, and Elsie doing things with soil composition and crop rotation that started producing results in the kitchen garden that Gideon observed with the careful attention of someone updating his own knowledge. "The south bed yield is up a third over last year," he said one September evening, looking at Adeline's crop records. "Elsie changed the planting intervals," Adeline said. "She got it from the correspondence course." He was quiet for a moment. "She knows what she's doing." "She always did. Now she has the language for it." A chart. Nora's education was the most contested, which surprised no one who knew Nora. She engaged with Margaret with the same frontal directness she engaged with everything, pushing back on interpretations she disagreed with, demanding explanations for conclusions that felt assumed, occasionally driving Margaret to the edge of her patience and then pulling back just before crossing it, with the instinctive precision of someone who knew exactly where lines were. Margaret told Gideon privately that Nora was the most challenging student she'd taught in 15 years. She said it as a compliment. Gideon relayed this to Adeline, who relayed it to Nora, who said, "Good." What Margaret identified in Nora, and what she told Adeline in one of their occasional conversations that happened in the kitchen after the younger ones were in bed, was a quality she called adversarial intelligence. "She tests everything," Margaret said. "Most people stop doing that by the time they're 12. It gets trained out of them. She hasn't let it." "Roland tried," Adeline said. Margaret looked at her. "What happened?" "Nora," Adeline said simply. Margaret nodded and drank her coffee. Outside, the Kansas night was enormous and full of stars, and the horses were quiet in the barn, and Lucy was talking in her sleep down the hall. A habit she had, full sentences that made no sense, conversations with people who weren't there. "What about you?" Margaret asked. Adeline looked at the ledger she'd been working on. "What about me?" "You keep everyone's accounts. You manage this household and half the ranch. You testified in a courtroom at 15. Margaret's voice was not unkind, but it was direct in the way it always was. "What do you want? For yourself?" Adeline thought about it. She hadn't been asked that question in so long that the shape of it was slightly unfamiliar. "I want the ranch to be solvent," she said. "I want my sisters to have real choices. I want—" She stopped. "I want to know enough about how things work that nobody can use my ignorance against me again." "That's practical," Margaret said, "and defensive." "I know. What would you want if you weren't afraid?" Adeline was quiet for a while. The stove ticked. Lucy murmured something down the hall. "I think I'd want to do what we're doing," she said finally. "I think I'd want to build something that stays." She looked at the ledger. "I just want it to be mine. Actually mine. Not because there was no one else available." Margaret set her cup down. "Then that's what we're working toward," she said, in the tone of someone adding a line to a lesson plan. It was October when Gideon got sick enough that he couldn't ignore it anymore. He'd been managing the cough since before the girls arrived. They'd known that, Nora had identified it in the first week. But managing was different from fine, and in October, fine stopped being available. He came back from a fence-riding morning so pale that Adeline stopped what she was doing in the yard and looked at him with an expression she didn't try to hide. And he got off his horse and said, "I know. You need a doctor. I know. When were you going to tell us?" He tied the horse to the rail and didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. He hadn't been going to tell them, or hadn't decided, or had been in the particular state of men who know something is wrong and apply the management strategy of continuing to work until the problem resolves or they collapse. "Doc Ferris in Caldwell," Adeline said. "Tomorrow." "It's a busy time for the ranch." "Tomorrow," she said. "Nora and I can manage the morning chores. You know we can." He looked at her. Then he nodded. Doc Ferris examined him the next morning while the girls waited in the wagon. He came out after an hour and spoke to Gideon on the clinic porch, too quietly for Adeline to hear. On the drive home, Gideon told them it was a lung condition. Chronic, the doctor had said, manageable with the right treatment and rest, not immediately dangerous but requiring consistent care. "Manageable," Nora said. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means I need to stop riding in cold rain before dawn," he said, with the dry flatness that was his version of humor. "It means we're adjusting the work schedule," Adeline said. He looked at her. "Adeline, the chores aren't the problem. They're the management of the chores," she said. "You've been doing things by yourself out of habit, not necessity. We're here. Let us help properly." She said, "Let us help and not let me help deliberately," because it was true and because she'd noticed how he responded to things framed as collective rather than personal. He accepted things more easily when it wasn't just about him. He accepted this. Slowly, over the following weeks, the distribution of labor shifted in ways that were practical rather than symbolic. Adeline taking on the morning accounts and the correspondence with buyers, Nora handling the horse care that was most demanding on cold mornings, Elsie managing the kitchen garden's late-season preservation with a precision that reduced their winter food costs by an amount that showed clearly in the ledger. The ranch didn't stop working when Gideon rested. That surprised him, Adeline could tell. She suspected he'd spent so long as a solitary operation that he'd lost track of what it looked like when a place ran on more than one person. The adoption papers came in the spring of the following year. Calloway had drawn them up months earlier at Gideon's instruction, but the timing had been Adeline's suggestion. She'd said quietly and once that she thought they should wait until they'd been through one full year, not because she doubted it, but because she wanted it to be a decision made in full information, not in the relief of a crisis ending. He'd waited. That he had waited without argument was itself information. They signed on a Thursday in April, which was an entirely ordinary day on Thornridge Ranch. Elsie's second-year garden already showing its first green tips, Lucy deep into a book about animals that Margaret had found for her, Nora arguing with Margaret about something related to territorial water law that had come up in that week's lesson. The signing happened at the kitchen table, 4 signatures plus Gideon's, witnessed by Calloway, who had driven out from Wichita for it, and who shook everyone's hand with the brisk warmth of a man who was glad this particular file was closing. After Calloway left, the afternoon continued as it had been. Lucy went back to her book. Nora and Margaret continued their argument about water rights. Elsie went back to the garden. Gideon went to the barn. Adeline sat at the kitchen table for a little while with the signed copy of the papers in front of her, and she thought about her parents, and she thought about the auction platform, and she thought about 30 miles of prairie in the cold. And then she put the papers in the ledger box where the important documents were kept, and she went to start supper. Family, she was learning, did not announce itself with ceremony. It was mostly just the accumulation of ordinary days, the choosing to stay through the difficult ones, the gradual erosion of the distance between people who had started as strangers and ended as something that didn't have a cleaner word than home. That evening at supper, Lucy said, without looking up from passing the bread, "Are we going to call him something different now?" "Like what?" Nora said. "I don't know. Something." Everyone looked at Gideon, who looked at his plate, and then at Lucy, and then at no one in particular. "You can call me whatever feels right," he said. "I don't need a title." Lucy thought about it with the serious deliberateness she brought to important questions. "I'll think about it," she said, and took the bread back for a second piece. Gideon looked at his plate. His face did the thing it sometimes did, the thing that had no clean name, that appeared and disappeared before you could get a read on it. Adeline had been watching it long enough now to know what it was. She just stopped naming it grief because that wasn't quite right anymore. It was closer to something returning, something he'd set down so long ago he'd stopped believing it was still his. She looked back at her supper and said nothing. Some things you named and some things you just let be what they were. Outside, the prairie wind moved through the grass in the last of the April light, and the horses in the barn settled into the quiet of evening. And from down the hall came the particular sound of Elsie's boots, unhurried, coming in from the garden to eat. The ordinary sounds of a place that held people. The sound of something that was going to keep going. Years do not pass cleanly. That is the thing nobody tells you when you are young and surviving. You imagine that time will organize itself into before and after, that there will be a moment when you can look back and say that is where everything changed. But it doesn't work that way. What actually happens is slower and less dramatic and more permanent. Things shift. People grow into shapes you couldn't have predicted. The ranch that was 30 miles of frozen prairie and a stranger's wagon becomes the only place any of them can imagine being from. By the time Adeline was 22, Thorn Ridge Ranch was solvent for the first time in nearly a decade. She had not done it alone. That was important to her, that the accounting was accurate. Gideon had taught her the foundation. Margaret had given her the wider architecture. The girls themselves had each contributed something the ranch couldn't have managed without. But the specific work of turning the ledger from red to black, of restructuring the cattle contracts, and renegotiating with the railroad agent, and identifying which operations were costing more than they returned, that had been Adeline's, and she knew it, and she allowed herself to know it without apology. The railroad agent, a man named Prescott, who had been doing business with Thorn Ridge for 12 years, made the mistake during one negotiation of directing his offer to Gideon rather than to Adeline, who was sitting directly across the table from him with the contract spread in front of her. Gideon said, "She's the one you want to talk to." Prescott looked at Adeline with the recalibrating expression she'd gotten used to. Not hostile, just slow. The adjustment of a man whose mental map didn't have a 22-year-old woman in this particular position. She didn't wait for him to finish adjusting. She told him what the ranch needed and what she was willing to accept and what she would walk away from, and she'd done it without raising her voice or softening the numbers. And Prescott had listened and then negotiated seriously, and they'd come to terms that were better than anything Thorn Ridge had signed in 3 years. On the drive back, Gideon said, "Your father would have liked that." She thought about that for a long time before she answered. "I think I'm better at it than he was," she said finally. "He taught me the instinct. Margaret taught me the language. I learned the rest by doing it wrong first." Gideon looked at the road. "You didn't do it wrong very often." "More than you saw," she said. "I just fixed it before you had to." He almost smiled. After 7 years, she had learned to read the almost. Nora fell in love badly, which was the only way Nora did anything. His name was Cal Briggs, and he had been working as a ranch hand at the neighboring Donaher property for 3 years before Nora noticed him, which was itself an indication of how particular her standards were. He was not handsome in any conventional way. He was angular and quiet and had a way with horses that Nora recognized before she recognized anything else about him, because that was always how Nora saw people, through what they were good at and whether they were honest about the limits of it. Their courtship, if you could call it that, was mostly argument. Not hostile argument, the productive kind, the kind between two people who both have opinions and neither one is willing to perform agreement they don't feel. Adeline watched it develop over several months with the combination of amusement and recognition that came from knowing Nora. She mentioned it once, just to test the water. "Cal Briggs was here again," she said one evening. "He comes to look at Pewter's foal," Nora said. "He's been coming to look at Pewter's foal for 6 weeks. Nora looked at her with the expression she reserved for statements she found technically accurate and substantially misleading. "What's your point, Adeline?" "No point," Adeline said. "Good," Nora said, and went to bed. But she was different on the mornings after Cal had been by. Not softer. Nora didn't do soft, but slightly less braced, the way a person is when they've spent time with someone who doesn't require them to defend their own existence. Adeline noticed. She said nothing more about it. They married 2 years later in the yard at Thorn Ridge on a September afternoon in front of whoever wanted to come, which turned out to be a considerable number of people, neighbors, the Calloway family from Wichita who'd kept in loose contact, Doc Ferris and his wife, Margaret, and 3 of her former students who'd grown up in the county. Gideon stood at Nora's side because there was no one else who should, and he was not a man who made speeches, but he said one thing quietly to her before she walked forward, something that Adeline was too far away to hear. Later, she asked Nora what he'd said. Nora was quiet for a moment. He said your mother would have been proud. She said it quickly, looking at her hands. He'd never mentioned her before. Adeline thought about that. He doesn't say things until he's sure he means them. I know, Nora said. That's why it mattered. Elsie left for the Kansas City Agricultural College in the fall of the year she turned 19 with a scholarship she had applied for herself, written the essay for herself, and received without telling anyone she'd applied until the acceptance letter arrived. Gideon found out when the letter appeared on the kitchen table and sat down to read it with the expression of a man who was calculating several things at once. You applied without telling us, he said. I wasn't sure I'd get it, Elsie said. She was standing in the doorway with her hands in her apron pockets, which was her position when she was prepared to defend a decision. I didn't want to explain it and then not get it. You could have told us you were applying. I know. She didn't apologize. I'm telling you now. He looked at the letter again. Full scholarship, room and board, a 2-year certificate program in agricultural science. He set it on the table. When do you leave? He said. Elsie blinked. She'd been prepared for more resistance. October 1st. He nodded. He looked at the kitchen garden through the window. Elsie's garden, by now completely unrecognizable from the weedy patch she'd found on her first spring morning. 3 years of careful management had turned it into something that produced enough to supplement the ranch's food supply significantly and whose methods Gideon had started applying to other parts of the operation. Write and tell us how it goes, he said. That's it? Elsie said. What else do you want me to say? She stood there for a moment, slightly off balance in the way she got when expected friction didn't appear. I thought you'd say we needed me here. We do, he said, but you're not staying because we need you. That was never the arrangement. Elsie crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and put her arms around him, which startled him visibly. She was not a demonstrative person, and neither was he, and the hug was slightly awkward in the way of 2 people who mean it but are out of practice. He put one hand on her back briefly and then stepped back. Pack the heavy coat, he said. Kansas City gets cold off the river. She left on October 1st. She wrote every 2 weeks, long letters about soil chemistry and crop disease, and professors who were wrong about nitrogen cycles, and how she intended to tell them so. Adeline read every letter aloud at supper. Gideon listened with his eyes on his plate, but he listened to every word. Lucy grew up and became what she had always been going to be. The question was only ever the form it would take. The animal healing had started before anyone formally named it, in the way of Lucy's vocations, which arrived as facts before they arrived as decisions. She had been assisting Doc Ferris with farm animal cases since she was 13, initially because he'd come out to the ranch for a sick horse and she'd asked so many precise questions that he'd started bringing her along. By the time she was 18, she had more practical experience with large animal medicine than most men who called themselves practitioners. The territory's first formal licensing exam for animal doctors was offered in 1899, when Lucy was 19. She passed it with the highest score of anyone who sat that session. Doc Ferris, who had administered the exam himself as part of the examining committee, told Gideon afterward that he'd known the score before he'd finished reading the answers. There was a small ceremony for the licensing, which Lucy attended mostly to collect the certificate and then immediately directed the conversation back to a case she was working on involving a horse with a suspected bone infection. Adeline attended the ceremony and stood in the back and watched her youngest sister shake hands with the examining committee and thought about a 6-year-old with her face pressed into a coat on an auction platform, crying the small hiccuping cry of someone trying not to. The distance between that morning and this one was not something she had language for. It was too large and too specific and too full of ordinary days for any single word to hold it. She didn't try to find one. She just watched Lucy argue with the examining committee chairman about bone infections and thought that was more than enough. The letter from the territorial legislature arrived addressed to Adeline specifically, which was itself something, her name on an official document from the legislature, not Gideon's. They were inviting her to testify before the Committee on Civil Welfare Reform. Judge Whitmore's formal recommendation, filed 3 years after the original hearing, had moved slowly through the territorial system the way these things do, gathering signatures and revisions, and the gradual attention of people who had been watching its progress from the edges. Now it had reached the committee stage, and the committee wanted testimony from people with direct experience of the statute's application. Gideon read the letter and handed it back to her. "You'll go," he said. It was not a question. "I don't know what I'll say yet." "You'll know when you're there." "That's not how I prefer to operate," she said. "I know," he said. "You'll know anyway." She spent 2 weeks preparing, which for Adeline meant 2 weeks of the same kind of focused thinking she applied to ledgers, identifying the core argument, the evidence that supported it, the points that would be challenged and how to meet them. She was not going to stand in front of a legislative committee and be emotional. She was going to be precise and documented and impossible to dismiss, which required a different kind of preparation than emotional required. Margaret helped her. They sat at the kitchen table on 3 consecutive evenings going over the testimony draft while Gideon kept himself busy in other rooms, occasionally passing through to refill the coffee without being asked, which was his version of support. On the 3rd evening, Margaret set down the draft and said, "You know what the strongest part is?" "The procedural argument," Adeline said. "The inconsistency in how the statute is applied across counties." "No," Margaret said. "The part where you describe standing on the platform." Adeline looked at her. "You wrote 2 sentences about it," Margaret said. "They're the clearest 2 sentences in the document. Don't cut them." She went to the Capitol alone, which felt right. This was not Thorn Ridge business, not family business. This was something she was doing in her own name, with her own experience, for reasons that had grown past the personal into something wider. The legislative chamber was larger than the Caldwell courthouse and considerably less full, which she found grounding. A room that wasn't crowded was a room she could think clearly in. The committee members were 6 men of varying ages who looked at her with the same recalibrating expression she'd learned to wait out. She let them finish recalibrating and then began. She testified for 40 minutes. She was precise and she was documented, and she was, in 2 places, honest in a way that was not performed emotion, but just the plain truth stated plainly, which was sometimes harder than it sounded. She talked about the platform. She talked about what the statute had allowed to happen to 4 children, and why the gap it exploited was not accidental but structural. She talked about what the experience had cost and what it had built, and why neither of those things should have depended on a single man making a single decision in a single crowd of 40 people who watched in silence. "The law as written requires people to be exceptional," she said toward the end. "It requires that there be someone in the crowd willing to spend money they can't easily spare on strangers they've never met. That is not a welfare system. That is luck, and children should not be dependent on luck." One of the committee members, an older man in the center of the table who had been listening with his hands folded and his eyes steady, asked, "What would you have the legislature do specifically, Miss Hale?" She noted the name. Hale, not Mercer. She had been Hale for 4 years and it still registered when someone used it, a small, precise acknowledgement of what the adoption papers had meant. She laid out the specific amendments she was recommending. She had 3, drafted with Margaret's help and Calloway's legal review, each one targeted at a specific gap in the existing statute. No performance, no appeal to sympathy, just, here's the problem, here's a solution, here's why it would work. The committee member unfolded his hands. "You prepared this yourself?" "With assistance," she said. "Yes." He looked at his colleagues. Something moved around the table that she couldn't fully read. Not skepticism, not exactly approval, but the specific quality of attention that meant the room had shifted. "Thank you, Miss Hale," he said. "We'll take this under consideration." She took the train home. The statute was amended the following spring. Not exactly as she'd drafted, because statutes never came out exactly as anyone drafted them, the legislative process being what it was. But 2 of her 3 recommendations made it into the final language, and the third was incorporated in modified form into a separate welfare provision that went further than she'd asked for. Calloway sent her a copy of the final text with a note in his precise shorthand. You did this. Whatever anyone else tells you about committee processes and legislative history, understand that this did not exist before you walked into that chamber. She put the note in the ledger box with the adoption papers and the original hearing documents and the wire from Calloway that had told them to be in Caldwell on a Friday. The box was getting full. She thought she probably needed a bigger box. The Thanksgiving. When everyone came back at once was not planned to be significant. These things rarely are. Nora and Cal came from the neighboring county where they'd established their own small operation. Nora was pregnant with their second child and moving with the particular determined momentum of someone who refused to let a pregnancy rearrange her schedule. Cal brought a horse he wanted Nora to look at with Gideon because that was how Cal expressed affection. Through the practical, through here's a problem I trust you to think about with me. Elsie came back from Kansas City with a colleague, a woman named Ruth, who studied plant disease and who was, it became clear over the course of the visit, more than a colleague. Elsie introduced her without ceremony and without apology, in the direct way of someone who had decided that the people who mattered would accept what they were told, and the people who didn't accept it didn't matter. Gideon shook Ruth's hand and asked her about plant disease research, and spent most of the afternoon listening to her answers with genuine interest, because Gideon was many things, and a man who wasted time on disapproval of things that were none of his business was not one of them. Lucy came home with 3 cases worth of equipment and the energy of someone who had not stopped moving in 6 months. She was consulting across 4 counties now, the only licensed animal doctor within 100 miles who would make farm calls in winter. She sat down at the supper table and immediately started telling a story about a mule with a dislocated hip that she'd treated on the side of a road in the dark. And the story was extraordinary and slightly gruesome, and Lucy told it with the vivid enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loves their work. And Gideon listened to the whole thing with an expression that was something Adeline had spent years learning to name. It was pride. Plain, uncomplicated pride. The kind he'd had to learn how to feel again after 6 years of not feeling much of anything. Margaret came too. She had been living in the county seat for 2 years now, running a school she'd founded with Adeline's help, and a grant Adeline had helped her write. She came bearing 2 bottles of decent wine and sat at the table with the comfortable ease of someone who had earned her place at it. Adeline cooked because cooking was still hers, the one domestic task she'd kept when everything else expanded into work and management and things that had titles. She liked the kitchen because it was clear you started with raw ingredients and you ended with food, and the gap between them was entirely within your control, which was not true of most things she worked on. She was standing in the stove when Gideon came in, alone, which was unusual during a gathering. He poured himself coffee and stood at the window looking out at the yard where Cal and Lucy were arguing pleasantly about something near the barn, and Nora was sitting on the fence watching them with her arms crossed and her expression unreadable in the way that meant she was quietly enjoying herself. "You should be out there," Adeline said. "I'll go back out," he said. He drank his coffee. "I wanted a minute." She understood that. He still needed minutes after all these years, small retreats from the noise of people, not because the people were unwelcome, but because he was a man who had been alone for a long time, and part of him still needed to remember how to want company before he could fully enjoy it. "You're thinking about them," she said. She didn't need to say who. He was quiet for a moment. "I always am this time of year," he said. "That doesn't go away. I stopped expecting it to." She nodded. She didn't offer comfort because he wasn't asking for comfort. He was just saying a true thing, the way he'd started doing over years when he stopped managing everything interior into silence. "I think they'd like this house," she said, "the way it is now." He looked at the yard. Lucy had apparently won the argument because Cal was laughing and she was already walking away with the expression of someone who is gracious in victory exactly long enough to be out of sight. "I think so too," he said. They stood there for a moment, the two of them, in the kitchen that smelled like roasting meat and the particular warmth of a wood stove working hard on a cold day. "Adeline," he said. "I know," she said. And she did. That was the thing about 7 years in close quarters with a person who didn't waste words. You learned to hear the things they didn't say, and they didn't need to be said. and the not sane was itself a kind of language that meant more than most sentences did. He went back outside. She went back to the stove. Well, at the table that evening, with 9 people around it and more noise than the room had been built to hold, and Cal's horse opinion apparently still under active debate between him and Nora and Lucy, periodically interjecting with medical information nobody had asked for, Adeline looked around at all of it and thought about what she actually believed. She did not believe that everything happened for a reason. She'd watched too much go wrong for too many people to believe the ledger balanced that neatly. She did not believe that suffering was instructive in some clean, purposeful way. She knew what it had cost each of them to get to this table, and the cost was real, and the debt didn't disappear just because what they'd built was real too. What she believed was simpler and harder to articulate. She believed that people could choose even when the choices were terrible, even when the options were all bad. She believed that one person deciding not to look away in a crowd of 40 who did could be the hinge on which a life, or 4 lives, turned. She believed that was not a comfortable thing to believe because it meant the crowd's silence had also been a choice, and she'd had to make her peace with that understanding and not let it curdle into something that poisoned the rest. She believed that family was an action more than a condition, that it was the accumulated weight of showing up on ordinary days when nobody was watching and nothing dramatic was happening, and the only thing required of you was to keep being there. She believed this because she had watched Gideon Hale do it, imperfectly and without ceremony, for years. She looked at him at the head of the table, older now, the lung condition managed but present, hair gone mostly gray, sitting with his coffee and the particular expression of a man who cannot quite believe the noise in his own house, and is grateful for it anyway. He had not become a different person. He was still quiet where other men were loud, still required time to say things he meant, still forgot to mention things, and still had mornings where his hands shook. He had not been healed by them. They had not been saved by him, not in any clean story sense. What had happened was more ordinary and more durable than that. They had just kept choosing each other day after day, through difficult things and boring things and all the in-between things that make up most of a life. And the choosing, over time, had built something strong enough to hold all of them. Nora said something sharp to Cal across the table, and he laughed and said something back, and Lucy immediately took Nora's side on whatever it was. And Elsie and Ruth were talking to Margaret about the school, and the room was loud and imperfect and entirely, specifically real. Adeline picked up her fork. She had not come to this table gracefully. None of them had. They had come to it through an auction and a cold wagon and 30 miles of prairie and a courtroom and 6 weeks of waiting and years of ordinary mornings that were their own kind of hard. They had come to it as children who were terrified and angry and had every reason to stop trusting that things could be different. And they had come to it anyway. Not because they were exceptional, not because the story required it, but because they had learned in the most fundamental way what it meant to choose, and once you understood that choosing was possible, you couldn't unknow it. That was the thing worth keeping. Not the suffering that preceded it, not the victory in the courtroom, not even the statute amendment or the scholarship or the licensing certificate or the ranch turned solvent. The thing worth keeping was the understanding that you could look at a terrible circumstance and find, somewhere inside yourself, a capacity to act that the circumstance hadn't killed. That knowledge was not given. It was not inherited. It was built, slowly, by the people who refused to let it be taken. Lucy said something at the table that made everyone laugh at once. Even Gideon, even Margaret, who laughed rarely, and with great selectivity. Adeline laughed too. And then she passed the bread, and the evening went on, and the Kansas night settled around the ranch like it always had, enormous and indifferent and full of stars. And inside, the light stayed on,